To the Science Salon podcast. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. Those of you who are new here, this is the podcast of the Skeptic Society and Skeptic Magazine. And if you find this valuable, we appreciate your support through skeptic.com/donate or through Patreon. You can just go to our webpage, skeptic.com, and explore there, where you will find tons of free content, as well as the opportunity to subscribe to Skeptic Magazine. We're a quarterly publication devoted primarily to teaching science and critical thinking, promoting science and critical thinking and reason, which is very valuable in this so-called post-truth world, which we're also skeptical of that claim. We have a forthcoming issue cover story by Steve Pinker that we're not living in a post-truth world. So watch this space for that. And as you know, our most of my podcast guests have new books out, and that's kind of our beat. Today's guest is none other than Deepak Chopra with his new book, Metahuman, Unleashing Your Infinite Potential. As listeners to this podcast or readers of my books will know, Deepak and I have had a long and contentious relationship going back to the 1990s. We're now pretty good friends. I've tried to steelman his arguments and tried to understand where he's coming from in his worldview and vice versa. And I think we've made progress. Actually, I think in today's podcast, we made some progress in understanding some of the deeper issues in our worldview differences, which really do come down to these deep philosophical, possibly metaphysical ideas about the nature of reality, the nature of consciousness and the self, and that sort of thing. We got into that as well. His new book has a whole section at the end on sort of self-help, like how do you translate these concepts of non-duality and the self is an illusion and the subject-object split, the mind-body problem. The average person who's suffering, they don't care about any of this stuff. They just want to know, what can I do to change my life to make it better? And so we kind of drilled down on that. I pushed him pretty hard on that because it's one thing to just sort of string these sentences together or trying to make sense of even that, dive deep into these philosophical issues. But so what? I mean, it's interesting intellectually, but how does that translate into real world changes of your life for the better? So he actually had some pretty good ideas on there, although I had to really drill down into that to get that out, because Deepak loves talking about philosophy and physics and metaphysics and so on, which is all good. It's all good stuff. I love it too. So anyway, with that, I think Deepak needs no introduction. Pretty much everybody knows who he is. He's very famous. The author of many, many books, including, I also recommend The World of Worldviews, that he co-authored with my friend Leonard Mlodinow, the physicist, Celtic physicist. And there's also a chapter-by-chapter deep dive into the differences between Deepak and the worldview that Leonard represents, which is pretty mainstream science. So I also recommend that as well. Anyway, with that, I give you Deepak Chopra. Deepak Chopra, thanks for coming on the show. This is your first appearance on the Science Salon podcast. We've done a lot of media events together, but this will be our first, I think, recorded conversation in a different way, because we specialize in books, and you have a new book out. Here it is. Oh, thank you. We will release this on the day the book comes out. It's called Metahuman, Unleashing Your Infinite Potential. All right. So first of all, I have to say, the book, the first page of the book is a list of all your other books that you've written, 2 full pages worth. It's pretty amazing. How do you write so many books? I'm always curious as a writer, what your style of working is, how you crank out so many books.
I make notes every day about what I'm reflecting on, especially after meditation. And so I'm actually usually writing 2 or 3 books at the same time, not knowing which one is going to be finished. So it's kind of shooting the breeze, and then suddenly it starts to gel. And I'm a compulsive writer, so almost neurotic to some extent. So I write every day for at least 1 or 2 hours. My mornings are very leisurely, Michael, these days. I don't start my day till 11. I spend a lot of time in the morning in yoga, meditation, reflection, writing. And then usually I finish my day around 5 p.m. So my days are pretty focused and short, 11 to 5. And I don't work on weekends. I just read and write on weekends. So, it's taken a long time to get here, but here is where I am now.
So you meditate every day?
I meditate or reflect every day for up to 2 hours, yes.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, I mean, it's built up over a lifetime, but I find that it's now part of my routine.
So let's get into it. I thought we'd first focus on the new book and then seg from there to some of the other topics that we love to agree to disagree on. So Metahuman is the choice of a lifetime. This is your overview. It's strange then. So you open by saying how great life is in a golden age that we live in now and so forth, which we agree on. Then you say it's strange then that millions of people strive to improve their lives without improving their personal reality. So what's the difference there between a life and a personal reality, or what are you getting at there?
So personal reality is a projection of our conditioned mind. When you're born and you have a baby, so the baby has just awareness, no concepts, no constructs, no conditioning. If a baby looked at a book, it wouldn't see a book. It'd see a color, a shape, a form. So everything that we call an object, everything, including our own body, is first a perceptual experience. And then it becomes an object as a way of labeling it. This is a book to a conditioned mind. To an unconditioned mind, it's just a color, a form, a shape. And all our experiences are like that. They're colors, forms, shapes, sounds, sensations, images, feelings, and ultimately thoughts. Once we start creating stories around that, that becomes our conditioned mind, and that projects as our personal reality, including our reality of what we call the mind, the body, and the universe, and all an unified experience in our own self, but now conditioned through thousands of years of recycling of constructs. First religious constructs, mythical constructs, theological constructs, philosophical constructs, and now scientific constructs. Science is our biggest adventure, but it's still a story that we come up with, and it's based on, I think, subject-object split, which is artificial. There's me and then there's everything else. But
you've just presented a rather Lockean view of a sort of a blank slate of the human mind, that we're born with nothing. But we know that's not true, that babies are born with all kinds of templates and programs that are automatically running. And for example, babies don't really learn to walk. They already have a program for walking, and the body kind of grows into it. Same thing with language. Babies are born with the capacity to learn grammar and so forth, and which particular language you learn depends on where they're born. But there's programs already built in to the brain, so it's not a blank slate.
See, that's where you and I differ. I think the brain is a perceptual experience in the same way as any other experience. And to attribute consciousness to an object that is actually in our consciousness is a premise that can't be proven. You cannot prove that the brain is the source of those programs. Where I differ from you is, I say the consciousness has those programs, and they are species specific. And the brain is what appears as an object, but it is actually the correlate of the conditioned mind. And this conditioning is species specific. All perception is a learned phenomenon. So if you take, for example, kittens and you bring them up in a room that has only horizontal stripes, when these kittens grow up, they see only a horizontal world. If you take another group of kittens and bring them up in a room that has vertical stripes, they see only a vertical world. And when you look at their brains, they don't have the connections to see either vertical or horizontal stimuli. So our consciousness as a species of consciousness, human consciousness, has a program, yes, no question about it. And the program is built into our consciousness, and it's a potential for experience. So the baby can be exposed to 6 languages at the same time. My grandson, for example, can speak Mandarin, can speak Hindi, can speak English, and speak Spanish, and all correctly because he was exposed to those languages. What was exposed was his consciousness, which then created the program that you suggest is in the brain. I believe that the brain is another experience, a perceptual object. You cannot attribute perception to a perceived object.
Well, I think we're getting a little ahead of ourselves on the nature of consciousness and the mind-brain problem, which I want to get to in a moment. But again, it's not like anybody can learn a language. It's just a blank slate, or any species. Only human species. You can expose chimpanzees to all the language you want. They're not going to learn it because the brain does not have the templates for accepting the sounds and programming them as, grammatical sequences and so forth. Now, maybe that you mean species specific. The bat can't learn that. The cheetah can't learn that or whatever, but it's still evolution programmed it. And so we know from developmental psychologists at a very early age, babies, they can perceive all sorts of things that other species can't, exposed to it, including the sense of right and wrong. So like you write, for example, we have no idea why humans are designed to both love and hate, preach peace and practice violence, swing between happiness and despair, and lead lives governed by confidence one moment and self-doubt the next. Well, we have a pretty good idea of why people love and hate. We have theories of violence and aggression and theories of love and affection. And, evolutionary psychology has been working on this for decades now. And we have some pretty good theories about that. So why do you say we have no idea?
Who do you mean when you use the word we? What do you mean when you use the word we?
Well, what same thing you mean. You say we have no idea why humans are designed. Well, we is us, are humans. We do have a pretty good idea. Like if you ask us, a scientist, a social scientist, why are males more aggressive than females? They'll give you an answer. It has to do with testosterone and genetics and upbringing and so forth. So we have some idea. So what do you mean when you say we have no idea?
See, I'm questioning what is fundamental reality. Testosterone, the brain, the body, physical matter. These are human constructs for modes of knowing and experience in human consciousness. Anything that you can give a word to is a human creation. We have no idea how language evolved, for example. We have no idea how life evolved. These are things that we presume and take for granted. So when you say we have theories, theories are conceived in consciousness. Experiments are designed in consciousness. Observations are made in consciousness. And yet we don't have a clue as to what consciousness is. We use rational thought, but we don't know what the source of thought is. What is the source of thought? If you say it's an electrochemical activity in the brain, then you're attributing existential dilemmas to electrochemical activity. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. But this is what makes it difficult for the conversation to continue. You're basically saying there's no such thing as thoughts or words or whatever. Well, then what are we even talking about? I don't know if you're familiar with Thomas Nagel's book, The Last Word. I'll just read you my
Thomas Nagel, and I know he's eminent and well-known atheist, but I also know that he's questioning classical Darwinian evolution or the mechanics of how we think, what the ontological primitive of existence is. Is it physical matter? Is there even such a thing as physical matter? Because the more you look into the nature of matter, it starts to disappear.
Well, maybe at the quantum level, but at the macro level, here we are. This is a solid cup. Now, the quantum physicists may say this cup is actually made of nothing. It's mostly empty space. But at the macro level, it's not mostly empty space. It's solid. It holds the water. The water's not leaking through the empty space. So but anyway, but let me make my point about Nagel. Nagel calls what you're doing one thought too many. That is, he says, for example, truth, objectivity, and reason are non-negotiable. As soon as you're making a case for or against them, you're making a case, which means you're implicitly committed to truth, objectivity, and reason. Nagel calls this a Cartesian argument after the famous cogito ergo sum argument made by Descartes. That is, if you're arguing, do we even exist? That's one thought too many. Who's doing the arguing? Who's arguing that we exist? Somebody exists. Namely, just as the very fact that one might be questioning one's own existence shows that one must exist, the very fact that one is examining the question of truth, objectivity, and reason shows that one is committed to truth, objectivity, and reason. So Nagel calls this a transcendental argument, one that invokes preconditions for its own existence. As Nagel puts it, this is one thought too many. So I didn't think we were going to go this far so early, but the fact that you're even challenging the very idea of thoughts and reason and objectivity, to me, to my ears, that's a Nagel type one thought too many. There's nowhere to go from there.
I think if you want to understand what is reality, what is existence, then you have to face the fact that the most fundamental fact of existence is not existence, but awareness of existence. They go together.
But who's doing the aware? Who's aware?
Huh?
Who is aware of existence?
Awareness is aware of itself as existence. See, you're actually excluding a whole dimension of philosophy that has been prevalent in the East. And Western philosophers have only tackled it recently, if at all. And so what I'm referring to in this book is waking up from the conditioned mind to what is fundamental reality. Fundamental reality is not the conditioned human mind, even though it gives us the perceptual experience of this cup. But this is actually, before you can call it a cup, it's an experience. And before you can, when you call it an experience, it's a perceptual activity. Furthermore, it's a human perceptual activity and in human awareness. So at some level, this is a cup. At another level, it's just a perceptual activity in human consciousness in the same way as your body is, in the same way as your world is. In the absence of awareness, there's no experience of existence. So in Eastern non-dual traditions, awareness, which has no form, otherwise you'd be able to see it, therefore it's infinite, it's a formless ground of existence with infinite possibilities that get conditioned both culturally and specific to species as well. So when we, Thomas Nagel's expression, what is reality? What does the world look like to a bat? What does the world look like to an insect with 100 eyes? What does it look like to a butterfly who tastes the world through her feet, smells the world through her antenna, has 30,000 lenses to her eyes, and what is the experience to that particular species?
Sure.
So what I'm saying is, there's no such thing as absolute identity. Michael Shermer, Deepak Chopra, everything we have a word for is a very species-specific construct. In this case, a human construct. What I'm trying to say in this book is, if we were able to wake up from our projected, conditioned mind, doesn't matter how it's conditioned, scientifically, culturally, theologically, philosophically, we would see that only the formless is real. And without that formless, fundamental, ontological, primitive, which is consciousness, there's no experience. And in the absence of experience, there's no idea of existence. So existence and awareness of existence go together. And this is the fundamental problem that, the mind-body problem, as you call it. Nobody can explain any experience, any experience. You can see the biological correlates of that experience, but the whole issue is, how does a neural correlate, which is also an experience, create experience?
Yeah. I think we're talking at different levels. You mentioned at this
I
level or that level.
Maybe we are talking about what is called category error.
Maybe. One of my favorite quotes from Wittgenstein that I used as an epigram in Heavens on Earth: the real question of life after death isn't whether or not it exists, but even if it does, what problem this really solves. So let me ask you, what problem are you trying to solve with this latest book, Metahuman, but also your life's work really has kind of worked toward this? If the average person picks this up at a Barnes & Noble bookstore, they've never read Wittgenstein or Descartes or whatever, they just want to improve their lives. I'm depressed, or I'm unhappy with my job or whatever, and you want to help them by going metahuman or whatever. All these philosophical discussions, which are super interesting, what problems do they solve for the average person who's just kind of grinding through life? How are they going to take these ideas and translate them into real world solutions?
So, Michael, my background, as you know, is as a physician. I went into the healing profession because somewhere in my mind I wanted to address the problem of human suffering. And so humans suffer for many reasons, but including, lack of physical health, struggles in their personal relationships, maybe financial distress, maybe not having meaning or relevance in their lives, etc., etc. But let's say you address all these problems, there's still what we can call existential suffering in humans. We all know, because we are conscious beings, that there's old age, there's infirmity, and there's death. And this is the basis for all human seeking, ultimately, even the basis for religion and the basis for spiritual understanding. And what I've learned through my own tradition and my practice of self-reflection and meditation is that the contemplative traditions say that human suffering comes from 5 very fundamental misconceptions. Number one, not knowing the true nature of reality. We confuse our perceptual experiences with fundamental reality. Number two, grasping and clinging at experience which is ungraspable. Number three, fear of impermanence. Number four, identifying with a provisional identity that we call ego. And number five, the fear of death. Now, when you look deeply into these 5 issues that are the basis of existential suffering, you really come to the first one. What is fundamental reality? Is your body, mind, and world experience fundamental reality? Or is that a projected reality by something more fundamental, which is infinite and formless and intangible and unperceivable and non-conceptualizable and unimaginable, and therefore transcendent, as you said, quoting Thomas Nagel? And if that is fundamental, and if I can experience myself beyond all my provisional identities, it opens a door to creativity. It opens a door to going beyond the conditioned mind, which is, in a way, everyday experience is like a lucid dream in a vivid now. By lucid dream, I mean experience being ungraspable. When we started this conversation, that experience is over. By the time you hear my words, that experience is over. So Wittgenstein, whom we just quoted, also said, we are asleep, our life is a dream. But once in a while, we wake up enough to know that we are dreaming. So what do we wake up to? We wake up to the awareness in which mind, body, or that which we call mind, body, and world are a unified experience in that impersonal self. Everything else, personal, is a conditioned provisional identity and the cause of all human suffering. Other animals don't have this, presumably, because they don't wonder about existence, but we do.
All right, let's say I'm in an unhappy job, an unhappy marriage, and I don't like where I live, and so on. And I come to you, and you just give me that whole spiel. I'm like, how does that translate into me solving my problem? I'm just a concept. Reality doesn't really exist, and so on. How does the average person take that and with an actionable
I think
message?
This is where the so-called spiritual, even religious experience can help us. By that I mean the experience of transcendence, going beyond subject-object split, the emergence of Platonic qualities like love, compassion, empathy, joy, uh, creativity, insight, imagination, intuition. These are all very fundamental qualities of our awareness. They're Platonic truths. And once we embrace them, that alleviates our suffering because we no longer feel separate. And as a result of that, ultimately, we also lose the fear of death because the transcendent is beyond subject-object split. This is the essential non-dual spiritual experience that helps us navigate everything from personal relationships to our career, to finding meaning and purpose in our existence, and to finding creative solutions for everyday issues like relationships, like feeling separate. This is the most fundamental flaw or misperception we have, that there's me and then there's everything else, when in fact that which I call me is a part of the whole. And so when I talk about healing, when I talk about health, I talk about returning to the memory of wholeness, which is pure innocence without any constructs. As soon as you have constructs, you have a story. And then as soon as you have a story, you're bound by that story.
But just on that particular point, how can you not have constructs? Even the idea of constructs is a construct. It seems kind of tautological when you say it that way.
Yeah, but Michael, have you ever experienced awareness without perceptual or mental activity? Have you ever?
Certainly without words. You don't have to have words for concepts or percepts. For example, I'm trying to help you out here with the last part of your book is, a day by day activities guide, what you can do, like walking on the beach or go outside and look at the blue sky, try to see beyond the blue, really try. So I do this pretty much every day. I go to the beach with my dog, walk on the beach barefoot because you recommended that. I think that's a good idea. Or hiking or up in the mountains, just something away from computers, the internet, and so forth, just daily life. I think what you're after there, I don't know about the subject-object dualistic split and all that. Again, the average person is going to have no idea what you're talking about when you use those words. What they want to know is, when I go outside and I look up and you tell me to look beyond the blue, what am I doing there?
You're stretching and questioning your perceptual reality. We assume that our perceptual experience is fundamental truth with a capital T. But we cannot even explain our perceptual experiences. We don't know how we experience anything. The color has no location in the physical world. Sound has no location in the physical world. It's not present in space-time. Shape, form, sensation, thought, imagination, insight, intuition, every raw material that goes into shaping our experience of reality has no presence in the physical world. And yet we have come up with a construct called the physical world. And there is no such thing. In my view, there is no such thing as a physical world. Your body is a projection, and it is a perceptual activity, and it's a changing activity. It's a verb. It's not a noun. So is your mind. It's a changing experience, a changing perceptual activity, and so is the physical world, a changing perceptual activity. When you question, where is that perceptual activity happening, you come up with the only thing you can say is awareness, because without awareness, there's no experience. So then you go a little deeper. What is awareness? Does it have a shape? Does it have a form? Does it have a physical existence? And the answer is it doesn't. And if it doesn't, And if it is the basis of knowing of everything that we call existence, then I think it's worth spending a lifetime trying to find out what that fundamental experience is
So,
without
in a way,
fluctuating as
but
mind, body, universe.
I guess I'm asking: are you speaking metaphorically in a sense that I can therefore change my life because I created these concepts in the first place? I can recreate them in a new way that leads to less suffering, greater happiness, and that sort of
To
thing.
some extent, but there's ultimate liberation is liberation from all concepts, all
But
ideas.
even that's a concept. Liberating myself from concepts is a
We have
concept.
to use words to
Well,
communicate.
and I know that's right.
We
So
have
we're
to use
back.
words to communicate. But you see, my quest, my entire life has been based on what is fundamental truth. And I want to know that more than I know anything else. And, if I try to examine fundamental truth through logic without knowing the source of thought, then I'm already impeded. So, the yogic traditions, the word yoga means union with the self, which is the source of thought, which is the source of perception, which is the source of everything that we call reality, which is not reality. So here's a summary of everything I want to say. Summary. If you can see it, touch it, taste it, smell it, imagine it, conceptualize it, think about it, it's not real. What is real is inconceivable, unimaginable, formless, non-perceptual, perceptual, and yet without it, there would be no experience. So embrace the formless, which is your only absolute identity, and then form and phenomena are projected realities based on conditioned mind. Question your conditioned mind. Ask yourself, just because if I see it, is it the truth? Or is the truth that which allows me to see? That which cannot be seen, but without which there is no seeing. That which cannot be conceptualized, but without which there are no concepts. That which can't be imagined, but without which there is no imagination. What is that? And that is my only absolute identity. The rest is provisional. Michael Shermer is a provisional identity.
How is that even itself a concept? I mean, it seems self-negating.
Yes, if you question everything you are not, then what is left is that which you are.
Well, we're back to Descartes and the one thought too many. There's something that exists that's asking what exists.
That's it. What is it? Now, Descartes, in my view, was wrong. You see, when he says, I think, therefore I am, that's not correct. I am, therefore I think. I am has to be present before a thought arises. What is I am? I am is formless. It has no perceptual existence. It is the source of perceptual activity.
All right. So again,
the only difference between you and me, by the way, and it's not much of a difference. You're a physicalist, materialist, non-dualist. I'm a non-dualist too, but I don't believe in physical reality. I think physical reality is a species-specific experience. What we call empirical facts are species-specific observations through human consciousness, using, of course, a human brain as the instrument for observation.
Yeah, I would. The way I characterize it in Heavens on Earth is that you're embracing a what I call a hang on, let me see. It's the strong. What did I call this? The
anthropic principle.
Yeah, but not the strong consciousness principle, and I embrace the weak consciousness principle. So you write, for example, in your book, "You Are the Universe." Consciousness is fundamental and without cause. It is the ground state of existence. As conscious beings, humans cannot experience, measure, or conceive of a reality devoid of consciousness. And then I write, well, yes, that's true by definition. You have to be conscious to experience anything. So when Deepak proposes that consciousness and the universe are equivalent in the sense that, quote, undeniable fact that any universe is only knowable through the human mind's ability to perceive reality, he is stating the obvious. Call this the weak consciousness principle. You have to be conscious to experience consciousness. But Deepak goes further than this when he says, quote, if all human knowledge is rooted in consciousness, perhaps we're viewing not the real universe based on limitations of the brain, and that the apparent evolution of the cosmos since the Big Bang has been totally dependent on human consciousness. And then I conclude that's reversing the causal arrow from perception to determinism, from being consciously aware of the universe and trying to understand it to our own consciousness bringing about the universe. Call this the strong consciousness principle. So I think that's maybe where we differ. How far you want to take that consciousness determines reality versus the opposite.
I think without consciousness, we couldn't even have this conversation.
Well, true by definition, yes.
Without consciousness, we wouldn't be knowing that we have what we call a body, or we have a mind, or we experience the universe. Now, is that absolute truth? I believe it's not, because it's a very species-specific activity. The only universe you know is a human universe. And that is not the absolute universe. It cannot be. I mean, if every species has its own experience of reality, what is the real picture of the world? What does the world really look like? And I don't think there is such a thing. It depends on who's looking, how they've been conditioned to look. The only difference between you and me is our conditioned mind right now. That's it.
Yeah. You quote Pinker in your book, true to his faith in reason, logic, and science. Pinker says, and then you go on talking his quotes about evolutionary psychology, explaining how the mind works. But I think Steve would say, I don't have faith in reason. It's just a tool. I use reason.
I would agree with that. If he uses reason to project a certain logic, that's fine. But we don't know the source of reason. We do not know the source of thought.
We don't,
so without knowing the source of thought,
yeah,
reason has very limited application.
But again, that's Nagel's one thought too many. It just is. And maybe consciousness just is. Let me read you the portion from Enlightenment Now, since you're quoting Pinker from that book. And maybe we actually agree on this on some level. Here's Steve. In the end, I still think that the hard problem is a meaningful conceptual problem, but I agree with Dennett that it is not a meaningful scientific problem. No one will ever get a grant to study whether you are a zombie or whether the same Captain Kirk walks on the deck of the Enterprise as the surface of Zakdorn. And I agree with several other philosophers that it may be futile to hope for a solution at all precisely because it is a conceptual problem, or more accurately, a problem with our concepts. As Thomas Nagel put it in his famous essay, What's It Like to Be a Bat? There may be, quote, facts which could not ever be represented or comprehended by human beings, even if the species lasted forever, simply because our structure does not permit us to operate with concepts of the requisite type. The philosopher Colin McGinn has run with this idea, arguing that there is a mismatch between our cognitive tools for explaining reality, namely chains of causes and effects, analysis into parts and their interactions, and modeling and mathematical equations, and the nature of the hard problem of consciousness, which is intuitively holistic. That he was quoting Colin McGinn there. Back to Pinker. Our best science tells us that consciousness consists of a global workspace representing our current goals, memories, and surroundings implemented in synchronized neural firing in frontal parietal circuitry. But the last dollop of the theory, what it subjectively feels like something to be such circuitry, may have to be stipulated as a fact about reality where explanation stops.
I think that's very good. I don't disagree with anything that you've just quoted. That's why one of my favorite quotes is from Rumi, exchange your cleverness for bewilderment. And if you're not bewildered by existence, then your humanity is incomplete.
Okay. So, but again, back to...
Because it is bewilderment that gives rise to wonder. Yeah. And wonder gives rise to humility. And humility ultimately gives rise to reverence for existence and reverence for awareness of existence. For me, that is a spiritual, transcendent experience beyond the subject-object split and rational.
Okay, but let's say somebody's listening to this podcast and they're depressed, they hate their job, they hate their life, and they're like, okay, say you're right. What do I do with this? Should I quit my job? Should I get divorced? Should I move? What do I do?
There's something that is emerging now in the psychological and psychiatric literature and it is called awareness-based cognitive therapy, where you become aware of a thought, and when you become aware of a thought, whatever it is, depressive thought, suicidal thought, happy thought, there's the realization that you are not your thought. The awareness of a thought is intrinsically free of that thought. And once you start to recognize that awareness is intrinsically free of thought, of perception, of cognition, of interpretation, then you're getting more to the level of fundamental reality, which is pure potentiality, the immeasurable potential of all that exists, all that has ever existed, and all that will ever exist, awareness, without which there is no experience possible. Shift your identity from experience to that in which experience arises and subsides, and that's a glimmering of freedom from constructs that are provisional identities, including the construct of birth and death. Birth and death are constructs based on provisional false identity.
Maybe an example would be one, I just recorded a podcast with Bruce Hood, whose forthcoming book is called Possessed, and it's on the psychology of ownership. And basically his argument is that we're too attached to objects, and we tether our sense of status and ego and self-confidence and sense of self to things that are temporal and can't really bring us happiness because of the hedonic treadmill. We'll never have enough stuff and so on. Anyway, maybe what you're talking about here would be an example of what Bruce is suggesting is we have to let go of the attachment to these possessions, because psychological science shows us they don't make you happier after some certain level of stuff. That's not where a meaningful life comes from. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, I'm talking about exactly that. I have no argument with that, but I'm also talking about how do you untether yourself from every provisional identity? Is there an absolute identity that is not personal? And once you can, there is something called awakening from personal reality, where identity doesn't go away. The person goes away, but identity doesn't go away. Because the person itself is a provisional identity.
Mm-hmm. So therapeutically, you would suggest essentially redesigning your identity, because you designed it in the first place. There's no absolute sense. There's no absolute self. You create it as you go from one moment to the next.
Yes.
So you would tell the person who's suffering, redefine your identity, who you are. Something like that?
Can you experience an identity which is not tethered to provisional, impermanent, ever-shifting form and phenomena? Everything that you call a form is actually a phenomenon. And everything that we call a phenomenon is the arising and subsiding of perceptual activity in formless being. So, the great Indian poet Tagore said, in this playhouse of infinite forms, I caught sight of the formless, and so my life was blessed. Find your formless self to know that identity never goes away. Only how you interpret identity is what goes away.
Yeah. I was looking for I took your test in here. I think it was your dualism.
Right, beginning.
Yeah. Let me find that again here. It was pretty interesting. I scored a 62, whatever that means. Hang on, let me pull it. That's pretty good, really. I'm so surprised.
Well, that definitely shows a great level of self-awareness. I think that's the key. Most people are biological robots. There's no self-awareness, and unless we are aware of ourselves, we cannot interpret the world, because the world is a projection of our conditioned mind.
Okay, just for listeners who won't be familiar with this, which is most of my listeners, I suspect, this is a survey developed by John Aston and David Buteline called the Nondual Embodiment Thematic Inventory, NETI, Nondual Embodiment Thematic Inventory. Google it. On a scale of 20 to 100, NETI assesses how people rank themselves on qualities long considered spiritual, psychological, or moral. They include metahuman traits we already value highly because they are so meaningful, as well as other traits that make life easier to cope with, such as compassion, resilience, propensity to surrender, interest in truth, and so forth. So, for example, on a scale of 1 to 5, never, rarely, sometimes, most of the time, all of the time, I'll just read a couple of these questions to give listeners an idea of what we're talking about here. An inner contentment that is not contingent or dependent upon circumstances, objects, or the actions of other people. I circled sometimes, a 3. Sometimes I can't help myself. I just, my inner contentment is linked to, how my day is going. But other times when I try to channel my inner Deepak, I think, well, but really, Deepak says, live in the now. Don't get too attached to these things. The past has already happened. The future hasn't happened yet. You only have the now. So then I think, yeah, okay. So sometimes I can distance myself from these circumstances, objects, or actions of other people. That's what you're talking about. As a practical guide, trying to move toward that more non-dual embodiment. Is that what you're after here?
Talking, and Michael, I have to say, in all fairness, some of the contentious debates we've had have brought me more self-awareness about my own weaknesses too.
Okay, good.
And my desire to be right all the time. Because, our desire to be right is also based on our conditioning. Nobody changes their mind ultimately.
Right. Here's number 3, an interest in clearly seeing the reality or truth about myself, the world, and others, rather than in feeling a particular way. I put all of the time. I always want to try to understand the truth about myself. I'm not sure what that means. A sense that my actions in life are motivated by fear or mistrust. Yeah, there I put rarely, number 4. Sometimes these questions are reversed, which is fine. It's good survey technique. But so what you're after there is, if you lead a life based on fear and mistrust, that concept has physiological effects on your body, increases stress hormones, presumably, that sort of thing.
And all that fear and mistrust comes from the illusion of the separate self, which is a socially induced hallucination. The separate self doesn't exist. That is the fundamental truth of spiritual experience. Well, as long as you think of yourself as separate from the world, you will live in anxiety.
Well, there is a self. What you mean is that it's always changing. There's no fixed self. You mean fixed self.
Only the formless is non-changing. Anything that has form is a phenomenon, and it's ever-changing. Only the formless self. Have you ever experienced yourself with no perceptual or cognitive activity? That is what I'm talking about.
Yeah. You're familiar with the Big 5 personality inventory, OCEAN, OCEAN, openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, introversion, OCEA, agreeableness, and then neuroticism. All right, so there's a huge body of literature research on this, showing that with behavior genetic studies of twins reared apart who take this test, about 50 to 60% of the variation is accountable for by genetics. You essentially, your temperament, your personality, how open to experiences you are, how agreeable or disagreeable you are, is at least half genetically programmed. So here I'm thinking of the self may be changing. I'm not sure about formless, but it may be constantly changing from one moment to the next. But there is kind of a sense that of who I am as a person. I tend to be open to experience. I'm not as conscientious as other people I know. I'm fairly agreeable, sometimes disagreeable, and so I'm not very neurotic. I'm pretty nice and peaceful, and not anxious or fearful. And research shows that those characteristics last throughout the lifetime pretty consistently. Isn't that an argument that there is something like a self? Even if it can be tweaked and changed and go down slightly different paths, the channel is fairly deep. The walls may be wide, but you're still within those walls of the channel moving along through life.
I don't think there's such a thing as a person, personally. A person is a process in consciousness, and it's an ungraspable process. If you think you're a person, then you'll see people everywhere. But if you think of yourself as awareness, you will experience love because there's no separation. Love is not a sentiment. Love is not an emotion. Love is the ultimate truth at the heart of creation, which is there is only awareness, and everything else is a provisional activity in that. And that you can experience. Your absolute formless being is experienceable. It's like entering a dark room and saying, I see nothing, but I still exist. It's like deep sleep. Awareness is already there even in deep sleep. It's like death. When you are not tethered to any experience, you're fundamentally free to create any experience.
Yeah, I don't know. That's beyond my spiritual wokeness, I guess, that language. When I love my wife, I don't think of it as just, I think of...
Who's the I? Who's the I that loves...
yeah, me, Michael Shermer. That's the kind of core self.
Shermer is a very provisional identity. It'll be over in a few years.
Yeah, but it's a good one while it lasts. It may be illusion, but it's a great illusion.
I think we can all upgrade the dream in the way you suggest, but it's still a dream.
But for example, when I love my wife, it's a person I love. It's not an awareness or a concept. It may be on some philosophical level.
You're attached to that experience in the same way as you're attached to your own body as an experience. But they're all provisional experiences. They're ungraspable. Every perceptual experience is a snapshot. The only thing that gives continuity to the snapshots is the presence of being or awareness, without which it would be just totally random and not meaningful at all. The meaning is given by you.
I want to be sensitive to your time, Deepak. I know you're wrapping up here and you got to move on to other interviews and stuff. One of the favorite passages from the book, I'll give you a chance to kind of wrap up and riff on this. At its most universal, enlightenment is simply expanded self-awareness. We go beyond stories, beyond fixed boundaries, beyond the rickety construct of I. And in doing so, awareness effortlessly expands. It expands naturally of its own accord because stories, boundaries, and limitations were artificial to begin with. All right, so give us an actionable take-home message. Listeners to this podcast, what can we learn? How can we become more enlightened, and what will it do?
Michael, right now, either close your eyes or just have unfocused eyes,
okay.
Which means
okay, I'll do that.
Focus and be aware of your breath.
Okay.
And now bring your awareness to your heart.
Okay.
And mentally ask the question, who am I? What am I? Don't try to answer it. Just ask the question.
Okay.
Now ask the question, what is it that wants to know?
Okay.
Now ask the question, what do I want from my life?
Okay.
And now ask the question, do I have a purpose? And finally ask the question, what am I grateful for? So if you ask these questions and don't try to answer the questions, your awareness will lead you to the answers. As Heisenberg said, nature never reveals herself to us as she is, but only as exposed to our methods of questioning.
So there's no correct answers to those questions. They're my answers. And those answers, they may change.
There are insights, and these insights get deeper. You have to live the questions in order to move into the answers. Okay. And every answer is provisional, depending on the degree of self-awareness you have.
I think the effect of doing that untethers you from the momentary stresses of life and meaningless worries, and gets you to focus on what really matters. And I think that's what you're after here. With all these debates we've had about the nature of reality and consciousness and physics and so forth, I think this is what you're after, right?
I am. I'm after what is fundamental truth. Is there such a thing? Is there identity beyond a person? And I have experienced identity without constructs. Mm-hmm. As Rumi said, God's language is silence. Everything else is poor translation.
Mm-hmm. Well, I will continue to try to translate my own life into some more meaningful, purposeful existence. Deepak, thanks so much. I've always appreciated our friendship and even the stressful times that we both learned from that. Let's continue to go forward and trying to become more enlightened.
Let's continue our quest for self-awareness.
Sounds good.
Thanks,
Deepak.
Thanks. Great talk.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.